History is full of the seemingly tiny what if moments where, if something small happened differently, the ripple effect would mean pages of human history would be completely changed. In 1773, there was such an occasion where a young midshipman named Horatio Nelson crossed paths with a single bear in the far northern waters of the Arctic Sea. A teenage boy's misguided confidence almost changed the course of Royal Navy history and deprived England of one of her greatest war heroes. This is the story of Nelson versus the polar bear. In 1772, Nelson had returned from a brief spell in the merchant service and had again joined the Royal Navy under his uncle, Captain Maurice Suckling. Now a senior captain posted to the Triumph of 74 guns, Suckling worked as an administrative captain, the Triumph serving as a guard ship in the Thames estuary. Nelson was a 14-year-old busy and determined youth with a disdain for the Navy and a desire for freedom and adventure. Ill suited to a guard ship, Suckling would put him to work that spring honing his navigational and small boat skills, sailing all around Chatham Dockyard, Sheerness, and within the Thames estuary. While a few months earlier in London, a group of men of science and exploration were eager to take advantage of the peace to encourage the Royal Navy to pursue other goals for England. Captain Cook had recently returned from his first voyage around the world with the relative discovery of the continent of Australia. There was now many eager to fill in the northern sections of the map and see if there was any truth to the myth that there was an open ocean beyond the northern reaches that did not freeze and could be traversed to other places. To this end, an application was put through the Royal Society of London to fund an expedition of exploration and science to sail via the North Pole in search of open seas and passages. The mission was approved. The expedition was to be led by the Honorable Captain Constantine Phipps, who for the purpose would take command of one of two bomb vessels with specially reinforced hulls, his flagship being the HMS Racehorse. Born 1744, Constantine Phipps was the first son of Baron of Mulgrave. He attended college, developing a love for science before joining the Royal Navy at age 15. By 1772, before taking command of this expedition, he had been a captain for 8 years, commanding a sloop and a small frigate. His second in command would be Captain Skeffington Lutwidge. Born in 1737, Skeffington had first become a lieutenant in 1759, serving as a lieutenant in the Siege of Quebec. He would command a cutter for a few years over the next decade and felt fortunate at the age of 35 to be appointed second in command of the expedition and captain of the HMS Carcass, the other 8-gun converted bomb vessel. That spring, the two ships were undergoing their significant refit at the Chatham Dockyard, where the young Nelson, sailing past the ships in his local travels, soon heard about the expedition and begged his uncle to be included with the crew. Nelson's request would go on to be fulfilled. He'd be permitted to join under Captain Lutwidge in the position of coxswain. He would be the youngest on the expedition by a few years, the ships having avoided including anything but men on account of the harsh conditions they expected to encounter. An interesting note, that summer sailing in and around Chatham, young Nelson would have also been under the shadow of his future flagship Victory, which was sitting in reserve in the Chatham dockyard. It's interesting to consider the feelings Nelson must have had to go from staring up at the huge three-decker as a young teenager to 30 years later walking her decks, the mighty ship now serving as his flagship. The Arctic expedition was a prominent mission. The first Sea Lord at the time, Lord Sandwich, personally checked the craftsmanship on the bomb vessels and confirmed the work was done to the officers' wishes. Included with the expedition would be a Dr. Irving, who had recently pioneered a distilling machine to purify salt water to fresh water. He'd be accompanying them to operate this new machine and learn from the trip. This purification method would go on to reliably provide 34 to 40 gallons of fresh water per day for the crew. They sailed on June 4th, 1772, heading almost due north, and by July 6th the ships had reached previously recorded northern limits off Svalbard Island, meeting with increasingly solid ice ahead of them. Nevertheless, they pushed on, ranging about looking for clear passage, taking advantage of some of the open water caused by the currents and tides of Svalbard. On July 30th, the ship's logs reported them having reached this point along the northern coast. For some time, the ships had been using a kedging technique where they would lay 3 anchors out on the ice ahead of the ship and then pull in on those anchors, hauling the ship forward and allowing the thick-hulled bomb vessels to push their way through the mixed ice flows. This method had allowed the ships to push through the semi-solid ice that blocked their passage as they endeavored to move between open water channels. Around the 30th of July, the Greenlander pilots had become alarmed by their position relative to the season and were urging Captain Phipps to turn south to avoid being trapped within the ice. Phipps regarded them as being overly panicky and continued his hunt for clear water for another 10 days, before the regular ice buildup around the hulls became so thick that the crew would routinely walk between ships. Captain Phipps had overseen the crews manually kedging his ships for weeks, fighting day by day for less and less gain. He was becoming increasingly confident that there was little chance of a navigational passage over the North Pole, much less any open seas to the north. He finally consented in early August, ordering the ships to turn back and head south more or less the way the expedition had come. However, the season was progressing quick. Previous routes were now frozen solid, and they were unable to catch their way back through the ice. Both captains found themselves obliged to start using their crew to saw their way through, cutting and hauling clear 12-foot blocks of ice at a time, the crews creating free channels for the ships to pass as they slowly made their way between the less and less frequent open channels leading south. It was at this time that Nelson had his first experience with large Nordic animals. While seeking clear passage in a patch of ocean, one of Racehorse's boats had a curious walrus come up to check out the boat and its crew. Walruses are large sea animals, generally characterized first and foremost by their size, Atlantic walruses weighing anywhere from 12 to 2,000 pounds, and are characterized secondly by a pair of large prominent tusks on their faces. The officer aboard the Racehorse's boat would likely have heard of walruses if never having actually seen one before. The men reported the animal to have strangely understanding and human like eyes, which, with interesting 18th century thinking, meant the officer decided to try and kill it. Doing so by shooting it with a musket, the ball not strong enough to succeed in doing more than injuring the large animal, did greatly succeed in upsetting it. A walrus, being a herd animal, lives in large pods under a dominant bull, its cries soon alerting the rest of the pod, who now returned in numbers, led by a large bull walrus, presumably none too thrilled that the boat's crew had attacked one of his wives. The 7 to 10-foot beasts now circled the 22-foot boat, the crew battling to stop them from staving in or capsizing it, when luckily Nelson would arrive on scene with one of the Carcass's boats, the second boat full of men enough to scare the walruses away. It was only a few days later that Nelson, in a shining example of teenage cognition, would learn the wrong lesson from the prior incident, deciding that one large northern creature did not equal one determined Englishman with a stiff upper lip and a fighting spirit. It was around midnight on his watch in the perpetually lit northern summer that Nelson caught sight of a polar bear not too far away from the ship. Determined not to let it escape, he seized an old musket and leapt off the ship onto the ice, making off after the bear, with a single semi-willing companion from his boat's crew in tow. Nelson saying the 18th century equivalent of, "I've got this," with the same confidence of any 14-year-old boy today before spectacularly wiping out off his skateboard or bike. Setting out across the ice floes, Nelson followed the bear until a heavy fog picked up, closing invisibility to just a few meters. This caused some delay until Nelson discovered the bear's tracks, and they pressed on following the trail through the uneven ice. It was not long before Captain Lutwidge was woken and informed of the situation. Alarmed, he made his way on deck to see for himself. However, the crew of the HMS Carcass were to be kept in suspense with the fog lasting for close to 2 hours before lifting close to 3 a.m. The fog lifting for Nelson at the same time, upon looking around, he soon discovered the bear ahead not too far from where he stood. He rushed forward excitedly, closing the remaining distance, to find himself separated from the bear by a small chasm in the ice. The polar bear, noticing the two men, pauses and turns to study them. As the apex predator of the Arctic, the bear was unaccustomed to animals approaching him like this. He's confused and a bit curious. He also moves towards Nelson, held at bay by the same small patch of open water. Nelson's companion tugs at his coat. "Horatio, the Carcass is signaling the return flag. We must make for the ship." The horrified Captain Lutwidge and crew had spotted Nelson and his companion closing with the bear several hundred meters away from the ship and tried to call him back. Nelson, ignoring the signal, moves closer to the water's edge. He raises and shoulders the musket, aims directly into the bear's face, and pulls the trigger. A click and a tiny flash. Whether the old musket is frozen or the powder is wet, either way the musket misfires and is useless until reprimed. The bear, spooked by the sudden flash, flees back about 10 yards and turns to stare. Nelson's teenage brain watches it go and swells with confidence. Perhaps this beast isn't so fearsome after all. Turning the musket around, Nelson shrugs off his weak-willed companion, quoted to have cried, "Never mind, do but let me get a blow at this devil with the butt end of my musket, and we shall have him." However, even smaller 500-pound polar bears, much like 1,500-pound walruses, don't stay surprised for long, and now as the 100-pound human tried to close in on him with a small stick, the bear's disposition changed. It turned angrily to meet the incoming Nelson, who now rapidly gained a full appreciation for the size of the polar bear, was forced onto the defensive, using his musket club to try and hold the bear back, him and his companion having little choice but to start a retreat for the ship, the Carcass a long way off across the ice. Suddenly, a large boom explodes and rings out across the ice from the Carcass. Captain Lutwidge has ordered the crews to clear away and fire the signaling cannon. The crash spooks the bear, which runs off a short distance before it decides to grant the Royal Navy its current distinguished timeline, continuing on about its own polar bear business. Meanwhile, Nelson and his companion are able to beat a hasty and somewhat sheepish retreat back to the ship. Returning to the deck of the Carcass, Nelson would receive a strongly worded appraisal of his decision making from Captain Lutwidge, along with his decision to ignore the advice of his companion, being the repeated suggestions that he was ill advised to tackle a white bear with a single old musket. During this dressing down, the 14-year-old's physical appearance took the well known appearance that Nelson would display throughout his lifetime, frowning down with his lower lip jutted out. When asked what on earth had possessed him to ask so foolishly, the 14-year-old is quoting to have petulantly cried out, "Sir, I wish to kill the bear that I might carry his skin to my father." The Arctic expedition with the young Nelson would stay frozen in the ice through the winter until the following spring of 1773, when the melting ice relinquished its hold on the ships and they were able to return to England. The voyage would confirm the difficulties of navigating the northern reaches, amongst a number of other scientific discoveries. Interestingly enough, one of those was that the white bear was indeed a distinct species of larger bear that would go on to be called the polar bear. Captain Constantine Phipps would become the second Baron of Mulgrave and command the HMS Courageux of 74 guns, serving at both the first and second battles of Ushant, before retiring from the sea due to ill health in 1784. He would continue a political career, serving on the King's Privy Council until his death in 1792. Somehow, all stories seem to lead back to HMS Courageux, as for the third time in 5 videos, I find myself referencing to please check out this channel's short video on HMS Courageux if you're interested to learn more about her story and tragic loss. Captain Skeffington Lutwidge's naval career would go on to great things. After HMS Carcass, he held multiple commands of increasing importance, starting with the command of a frigate through the American Revolutionary Wars. By 1797, he had reached flag rank, acting as the commander-in-chief on the Nore station for many years. Nelson would serve under him again while he commanded at the Nore. The pair reported to be quite fond of one another. It is from dining together all those years later, now as an admiral and captain, that Lutwidge is credited with first telling the story of Nelson versus the polar bear. Lutwidge would go on to retire a full admiral in 1810 before dying in 1814. The 14-year-old midshipman of questionable decision-making would go on to become a lieutenant 3 years later at the relatively normal age of 17, before taking command of a small sloop of 14 guns in 1779. It would take another 25 years before the energetic and eccentric young man's name would become a household name across England. For the future Lord Horatio Nelson, that is the story of how teenage overconfidence and a single bear almost deprived England and the Royal Navy of one of its greatest war heroes.